Hey everybody, it's Rob here at etrailer.com. Today we're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings Helper Springs for the rear axle on our 2013 Ram 1500. Now there's a lot of different reasons where Helper Springs may benefit you in your truck. If you happen to haul a lot of heavy loads in the bed of your truck, it's definitely going to help support that. Or if you tow a heavy trailer, it's definitely going to give you a lot more control and comfortability while you're driving. We actually use our truck for a lot of different things. A lot of times there's gear back here, but at the same time we do use our truck for a fifth wheel. So there's not a lot of times that we have the bed loaded down, but having that pin weight in the bed does put quite a bit of weight on the back axle. Once you have that much weight at the back axle, it ends up squatting down. So one, we're putting a lot of strain and stress on our rear suspension, not to mention we're putting a lot of strain and stress on the tires. Plus, it ends up kind of causing a teeter-totter effect. The back end goes down and the front end wants to start to stretch up, which all that really equates to is we're going to be blinding people when we're going down the road at night because our headlights are going to be higher up than they're supposed to be. And also, our tires aren't making contact with the ground the way they should be, so our steering and braking is going to be diminished, which all leads to just a very soft, mushy, uncomfortable, almost a little scary type of ride, depending on how much squat you get. So before we put our SumoSprings in place, I would like to take a quick few measurements to get a baseline, and then we can put a little bit of weight in the back of the truck and see how it handles it. So if I measure from the ground to about the center of the wheel well arch, back here it's coming in right about 39.5 inches. Now this is virtually no weight in the bed, so we don't have anything back here, so that 39.5 is right about factory height. And on the front here, the fender's coming in right about 37 inches. So we want to go ahead and write those numbers down or remember them so we can see how much everything is affecting everything. So I went ahead and added a heavy load to the back of the truck. We got this water tank back here. Now to give you an idea about how much it weighs, it's about 1,000 pounds. So to give you an idea, it did squat down the rear end. You can see that gap in between the fender and the tire is much smaller. So let's go ahead and take a few measurements and see how much it did affect it. So back here, the measurements are coming right about 36 inches. So we did lose quite a bit. You can see it squatted down. If we move up to the front, I almost guarantee you that it stretched that front suspension out. Now on the front here, it doesn't look like there's that much of a difference. But if I take a measurement from the center point again, it did go up about 3/4 of an inch. So again, not a huge difference, but that's stretching that suspension up, which means again, our tires aren't going to be in contact and we're not going to have an enjoyable ride because we're not going to have as much responsiveness. But with the weight in the back of the truck, let's take it on our test course and see how our Ram handles. So I'm going to come up to our slalom course and I'm going to keep it about 10 miles an hour so we can have a nice baseline run. Now, even just driving through the parking lot, I can immediately feel that weight's back there. And as I'm coming in and out of these turns, it definitely is a little nerve-wracking. I'm not going to lie, especially since it's water, it is shifting a lot of that weight around, which is definitely causing the body to roll and just not be as responsive as I want it to be. It's almost like I go into the turn and there's a slight pause before the turn. Then it turns, almost wants to lean and just kind of shift. And then when I come out of the turn to straighten everything out, it kind of does the same thing. It wants to hesitate and then almost overreact to where I want it to go. So I'm kind of having to make sure I have a firm grip on the steering wheel and really pay attention to where the front of my truck is pointing so I can make sure that I'm going to be going where I want to. It's not a horrible loose feeling, but it's pretty loose and it definitely makes it a lot worse feeling with all that weight in the back. Again, it's not that responsive and it really feels like I should slow down a little bit in and out of those turns. But now as we come up to our bumps course, this is going to give us a really good idea of how it's going to feel coming through the seat and how it's going to affect our suspension. I'm going to be going over these about 5 miles an hour so we can get another good solid baseline run. Now, as the front tires go over the bumps, it's not as bad, but as soon as those back ones go over, it's pretty stiff. I can imagine there's not a whole lot of travel left in the suspension, which means that it's probably pretty close to bottoming out, and all that jarring feeling is coming through the seat pretty rough. I would not want to drive this for a long time like this, but it's not completely unmanageable. Overall though, it definitely has a completely different feeling than a factory truck. Everything does feel a lot looser, kind of soft, not very responsive. Don't get me wrong, I understand that our truck's not a sports car, but I don't think many people would want to have that feeling of not being in control, especially when you're towing or hauling something really heavy behind it. Not to mention, if you're towing a camper, we want to go enjoy ourselves. We don't want to have to worry about our back getting beat up the entire time we're driving down the road. So here's what our SumoSprings look like once we have them installed. They're actually going to replace our factory Joust bumper, and they're going to mount in between the axle and the frame. That way they can provide us that support whenever we do have a heavy load in the back or we're towing a trailer. Because the frame is going to want to start to come down as the weight comes in, but the spring here is going to make contact with the axle and provide that support. And if you compare it to our factory Joust bumper, it's quite a bit larger. And actually, our factory Joust bumper really is only designed to do one thing, and that's prevent bottoming out, meaning they're preventing the frame from hitting the axle. So it hits this bumper before it hits it. Well, our SumoSprings are going to do a lot more than that. They're going to absorb a lot of the road shocks coming from our truck as we're driving because of the material it's made out of, and again, it's also going to support it. But the nice thing about the SumoSprings is that they're progressive in rate. So what that means is when we have a light load or there's not a whole lot of weight, our springs are going to start to engage softly and slowly compress. But the more weight we put on there, the harder and stiffer they're going to become and give us that much more support. So whenever we're driving around normal with no load in there, they should do a pretty good job of absorbing those road shocks and not stiffen up the ride so much that it's uncomfortable. Now we're going to have a SumoSpring on each side of our axle. They're not connected, so they are going to work independently from each other, which definitely helps out with those off-center loads. If you happen to have a toolbox on one side of your truck or something that's just really heavy on one side, one SumoSpring will take all that brunt and help support it, while the other one doesn't have a whole lot of weight on it. At the same time, it really helps out with body roll, because as we go in and out of the turns, the truck is going to want to start leaning, and that SumoSpring is going to engage the axle and start giving us that support and not allow it to lean as much. Now, whenever you're comparing these to other suspension upgrades, there's a few that a lot of people compare these to. A lot of people compare these to Timbrins because they're also a Joust style spring, but we've heard a lot of people say that the Timbrins provide a little bit more of a stiffer ride, and I think our SumoSprings are going to be a little bit softer. It may not provide as much support, but it's definitely more of a comfortable ride. Another option for a suspension upgrade in your Ram may be airbags. Now that's definitely more involved when it comes to the installation and maintenance, but that's the nice thing about our SumoSprings. It's an extremely quick and easy installation. There's no drilling involved, and there's no maintenance. We don't have to worry about running lines and checking and adjusting air pressures like you do with airbags. Our SumoSprings are going to provide up to 1,500 pounds of load leveling support. Now that doesn't mean it's going to increase the payload of our truck that much. They're just there to help out support that weight whenever we are towing and take some of those bumps and shocks out of the road whenever we're driving, so we can actually enjoy ourselves. Installed, I went ahead and put that same load of about 1,000 pounds back in the bed. Now you can visually see it's already helping out a little bit. It isn't squatting down quite as much. And if I measure from the same point, it's coming right about 38 inches. So we still are down a little bit from the factory height, but about an inch, inch and a half is about ideal. So right now, this is a really good area for it to sit. Let's go ahead and move up front and retake that measurement and see if it made it any better from stretching out that suspension. And up here at the front, we're actually right back to factory ride height. So our tires are going to be back on the ground with the appropriate amount of weight. So our steering and braking is going to be back to normal. And our headlights won't be blinding people if we're driving at night. But let's go ahead and take our truck back out on the test course and see how our SumoSprings actually handle. So I'm going to go about 5 miles an hour over the speed bumps again, just to keep that nice baseline run. Now I can already tell a pretty good difference. Don't get me wrong, the bumps are obviously there, but it seems like the truck wants to react a little bit quicker. It's not so much of a continuous bounce after we get over the bump, and the bumps in the back aren't as harsh. Like I said, they're still there. They're not going to completely go away, but it's a lot softer, a little bit easier to handle, and it's not so much of a jarring feeling going through your back. Now as I come up to the slalom course, I'm going to try to keep it at that 10 miles an hour. Now, I can already feel a pretty good difference. As soon as I go into a turn, it definitely wants to turn right away. There's not a big delay like there was. It's not as leaning as hard as it was before. It just reacts, turn the wheel, the truck wants to turn, and it honestly seems like I could go quite a bit faster, but considering we are carrying water, it does transfer the weight really odd sometimes. So we're going to keep it at that 10 miles an hour, but I can definitely say there's a major improvement in the body roll and how quickly our truck is responding. Again, even just going through the parking lot, hitting a few of the bumps, going around the turns, it just reacts much quicker, and it really feels like there's not anywhere near a big of a load as there is back there. Overall, I think our SumoSprings really did improve the ride quality, especially when we're carrying a load. So now that we've seen what they look like and gone over some of the features, let's bring the truck into the shop and we'll go through the installation process together so you can have the confidence to do it at home. To begin our installation, we want to park our Ram on a nice flat level surface. Now we will need to lift it up by the frame to allow the axle to hang down, and in our case, since the style of lift we're using, we can't do that, so I'm going to be using a jack stand underneath the hitch at the back to help lift it up and just stretch the suspension out. You don't need to remove the rear tires. If you want to, you can, but we just need a little bit of flex in the suspension, not even enough to take the wheels off. So we're going to go ahead and put a jack stand under here, and again, just lift it just a little bit so we have a little bit more room in between the axle and the frame. Next, we want to move underneath our truck, and if we come right to the rear axle and we look directly above it, we'll find our factory joust stop. Now this is just pressed into this cup right here, so you want to get a pry bar, something you can kind of wedge in there, and the main goal of this is to get it to pop out. Sometimes it can be a little awkward trying to find somewhere to pry on, but again, the main goal is just to grab, twist, pry that joust stop out so that we have a nice opening right here. Our next step is going to be putting the springs together. Now we're going to have the main body of the spring, a 1-inch spacer, and then a bracket that's going to have 8 studs and 2 holes on it. This bracket's going to be attached to our spring. Now you may or may not need to use the spacer in your application. The best way to really tell is you can actually get everything assembled real loosely, but once you lower everything down, you don't want your spring to be compressed with no weight in the bed. So we already have one side in, and we tested it both ways, and it fits better without the spacer in it on our truck. So if you're not going to be using the spacer, you want to grab the short bolt out of your kit, and if you are using the spacer, you want to grab the long bolt out of your kit. So we'll take our bracket now, and we're going to have 2 holes. We're going to line one of them up. We'll go ahead and take the hex bolt. We'll get it started, make sure it's threading in. We'll grab a 14mm socket and snug it up. Now the main thing is you want to get this snug just to where the spring isn't moving around, but you don't want to tighten it down so much that you end up stripping it out. And this may be a little bit easier to explain how this is going to go on rather than showing you, because my hands are going to be a little bit in the way. But those 8 studs that are going around, this center section is going to go up right against the bottom of that cup. And we're going to have these 2 upper bracket plates. They're going to go around that cup, and they're going to fit right over those studs. So we'll go ahead and get everything lifted up and in place, and then when we secure them down, we're going to be using washers and lock nuts. But again, just to give you a visual idea before we get it in there and my hands may be in the way. Now another thing I want to mention, you can see that I actually removed that bolt and moved it, and that's because we want to have the bolt that's attaching the spring on the farthest back hole and closest to the tire. So when we hold it up, we want it to be towards the back and offset towards that side. But we'll just kind of rest our joust bumper on the axle pad right there. We can grab our plate. I'm going to actually fit it over the cup first and kind of lift up on my spring. And we'll do the same thing for the other one. Just kind of lift up, make sure it lines up properly. And then for each one of the studs coming up, we're going to take a flat washer and a nylon lock nut to secure it down. So we're just going to go ahead and work our way around, putting all the hardware into each one of these studs. Now I'm going to come back with a 13mm socket. I'm going to snug up all the hardware. But whenever you're snugging it up, it's not a bad idea to kind of push on the two brackets to make sure they have a really secure connection around that factory cup. At least so we can get it started. Make sure it's really grabbing onto it. And we'll just go through and continue to tighten all the rest of the hardware. Now you may find that using a ratcheting wrench or something like that may be a little bit easier because you may have a hard time fitting a driver and a socket in between the frame here. Once all your bolts are tight on the driver's side, you can go ahead and move over to the passenger side and repeat that entire process. After you're done with that, you can go ahead and lower down your truck and you're ready to hit the road. So now with the weight back on the axle, you can see that there's barely a gap between the pad landing point and the spring itself. Now that's why we did not use that spacer, because if we did use that spacer, the spring would already begin to start to engage and start squishing. Well, that doesn't give us any kind of support because we don't even have any weight in the bed right now. Now that does happen quite often if you used your truck to tow a lot with and didn't have any kind of upgrades, because that ends up stressing our factory coil springs here, which just end up getting fatigued over time and don't have as much support to hold everything up. So we have very minimal of a gap here, so our springs are just going to engage a little bit sooner. But again, I'm Rob here at etrailer.com, and that'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings rear helper springs on our 2013 Ram 1500.